Report.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Very well. Yes, sir. Very well. At once. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Very well. Vehicle acknowledged. Vehicle acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Report.
Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Vehicle acknowledged. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reinforcements
Acknowledged.
have arrived.
Awaiting orders.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge.
Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Reinforcements have arrived.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Reconstruction options. Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Construction complete.
Waiting order. Acknowledge.
Reconstruction
Yes, sir.
options.
Acknowledge.
Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Building.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Reporting. Affirmative.
Comrade. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building.
Waiting order. Waiting order. Affirmative.
Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Report. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Construction options. Building. Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Building.
Yes, sir.
Construction
Affirmative.
complete. Unit ready. Unit lost. Building. On hold. Cancel. Building. Construction complete. Construction options. Low power. Building.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Repairing. Construction complete. Building. Unit repaired.
Yes, sir.
Construction
Acknowledged.
complete. Construction options. Building.
Yes, sir.
Report acknowledged.
Unable to comply. Building in progress. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle affirmative.
Our base is under attack. Construction complete. Cannot deploy here. New construction options. Unit ready. Building.
Affirmative. 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 Affirmative.
Insufficient funds. Construction
Acknowledged.
complete.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Awaiting for affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Awaiting. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building. Preparing.
Comrade, affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Reporting.
Construction complete. Building.
Vehicle reporting. Awaiting.
Unit
Acknowledged.
prepared.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Construction complete. Preparing. Unit repaired.
Perfect.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
It's done. Rocky. Lights out. It's done.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Report
Unit
affirmative.
lost.
Very well.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Vehicle reporting.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Repairing. Unit ready. Building.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Unit repaired.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Repaired.
Affirmative.
Construction complete. New construction options.
Yes, acknowledge.
Unit repaired.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Awaiting affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building.
Comrade.
Our
Affirmative.
base is under attack. Building. Repairing. On hold.
Awaiting or acknowledged.
Unit repaired. Unit
Reporting.
ready.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Construction
Vehicle affirmative.
complete. Cannot deploy here.
Yes, sir.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Building. Construction complete.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Insufficient funds. Repairing. Insufficient funds. Structure
sir.
sold. Repairing. Unit repaired.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Comrade.
Acknowledged.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Need a jump?
Reporting. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Need a jump? Let's dance. Lights out. Let's dance.
Vehicle report.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Vehicle acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Reporting. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Building. On hold. Cancelled.
Yes, sir. Affirmative. Vehicle report. Acknowledged.
Construction complete.
Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Comrade.
Affirmative.
Building. On hold.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Cancelled.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Construction complete. Primary building selected. Unit ready. Building.
Reporting.
Acknowledged. Comrade? Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Acknowledged.
Reporting.
Acknowledged.
Building.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Yes, sir.
Affirmative.
Prepare.
Vehicle reporting. Reporting. Affirmative.
Construction complete. Unit prepared.
Yes, sir.
Reporting. Affirmative.
Preparing.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Preparing. Unit prepared.
Yes, sir.
Reporting.
Yes, sir.
Reporting.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Unit
Acknowledged.
prepared.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Acknowledged.
Vehicle
Affirmative.
reporting.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Comrade?
Affirmative.
Preparing.
Comrade?
Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Unit prepared.
Reporting.
Preparing. Preparing.
Yes, sir.
Unit prepared.
Affirmative.
Preparing.
Yes, sir.
Unit prepared.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Comrade? Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Preparing.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Reporting.
Unit prepared.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Preparing.
Yes, sir. Reporting. Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit prepared.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Awaiting orders. Yes, sir.
Building. Unit prepared.
Reporting. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit ready.
Vehicle
Building.
reporting. Affirmative. Awaiting orders. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes,
ready.
sir. Acknowledged.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Report acknowledged. Vehicle reporting. Affirmative. Vehicle reporting.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Unit
At once.
lost.
Affirmative. Running agree. Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
ready.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Unit
Acknowledged.
ready.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Affirmative. Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Building.
Acknowledge.
Our base is under
Affirmative.
attack.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledge.
ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge.
Building.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Building. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Reporting.
Unit ready.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building.
Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir. Acknowledge.
Unit ready.
Affirmative. Affirmative.
Building. On hold. Cancel.
Vehicle reporting.
Acknowledged. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Reporting. Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting order. Affirmative.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Awaiting orders. Reporting.
Let's start.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Comrade.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit
Acknowledged.
lost.
Acknowledged. Affirmative. Acknowledged. Affirmative. 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 Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Very well. lost.
Affirmative. 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 Of course. Agreed. Affirmative. Agreed. At once. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. 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 Yes, sir.
Building.
Very well. Yes, sir. Very well. Very well.
Unit
Of
lost.
course.
Our base is
Affirmative.
under attack.
Very well.
Unit
Affirmative. Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Unit lost. Unit ready.
Yes, sir. Acknowledged.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledged.
Waiting order.
Acknowledged. Affirmative.
Unit lost. Unit lost. Building.
Yes. Acknowledged. Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Building. Unit lost.
Comrade. Waiting order. Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, affirmative.
lost.
Agreed.
Unit lost.
Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit
Acknowledge. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Affirmative.
Construction
Acknowledge.
complete.
Affirmative. Affirmative. Acknowledge.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
ready.
Affirmative.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
Agreed.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative. Yes, sir. Very well. Affirmative. Of course. Very, very well. Affirmative. Of course. Agreed.
Unit lost. Unit lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Very well.
lost.
At once.
Select target. Reinforcements have arrived. Building. Unit lost. Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Yes, sir.
Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Yes, sir.
Acknowledge. Affirmative. Acknowledge. 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 Affirmative. Acknowledge. Acknowledge.
Select target.
Yes, sir.
Unit
Affirmative.
lost.
Affirmative.
Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Acknowledged.
Unit lost. Unit
Yes, sir.
lost.
Affirmative. Very well. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Affirmative. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Affirmative. Ready and waiting. Very well. Yes, sir.
Insufficient funds. Construction complete. Reconstruction
Yes, sir.
options.
Acknowledged. Acknowledged.
Structure sold. Building.
Waiting. Affirmative. At once. Agreed. Yes, sir. Reporting. Yes, sir. Agreed. Yes, sir.
Unit lost.
Yes, sir.
Unit ready.
Report agreed. Very well.
Building.
Yes, sir. Affirmative.
Mission accomplished.